years of experience in trading, importing, and developing supply chains globally for a range of natural ingredients, including cashew, edible nuts, peanuts, dried fruits, spices, oil seeds, and pulses, now applied to a role in developing new exporters, advising institutions, research and value chain development, offering unique combination of skills, understanding, and international contract. He is one authority and guru to give you an entire overview of the global cashew kernel market. Coming to us live from Ireland, ladies and gentlemen, let's give a round of applause. He will be able to interact with you. वो आपको सुन सकेंगे. Let's make some noise for Mr. Jim Fitzpatrick.
So thank you for the invitation. Unfortunately, due to a family wedding, I can't be there with you, but I wish you an excellent and constructive conference. I'm going to try and give you an overview of the world cashew situation in 2024. I'm going to focus more on the long term than the immediate short term, although we will look at some immediate market factors too. You will find during this that I'm not going to talk much about India because I think everyone in the conference already knows about India, but I will try and place India into the global context. So let's start with an overview, and let's start by looking at production. So as you can see from the slide on the screen, global production is heavily centered in Africa these days. In 2024, we think about 56% of the world's cashews will grow on the continent of Africa. India, due to a smaller crop this year, is about 14%, and in Southeast Asia, we look at about 25%. Of that 25%, 18% is Cambodia. So Vietnam has faded, and we'll have a look a little bit at how Vietnam has faded a little bit later on. In Brazil, again, sharp drop in production over the past 10 years. Less than 3% of the world's cashews grow in Brazil today. Switching the focus to consumption, and the purple countries are the consumers, and the darker the color, the greater the level of consumption. India, of course, is by far and away the world leader in the consumption of cashew kernels. Europe and North America follow, and between them, they're roughly about the same level of consumption as India when it comes to kernels. Other areas of importance, the Middle East with about 6%, Asia, Oceania, excluding China, about 6%, and the real rising force in cashew consumption in recent years has been China. In 2023, about 12% of the world's cashews were consumed in China. Let's look at processing briefly, and we look at processing capacities and processing volumes, although not always fully utilized. In Vietnam, about 3.1 million tons. In India, around about 1.7 million, although I'm sure there is capacity for much more than that, if need be. In Africa, now capacity has risen. It's about 650,000 tons capacity, but again, it's highly underutilized. So the actual volumes processed will be less than that this year. Brazil essentially processes its crop. So this mismatch between production and processing, with production heavy in Africa, processing and consumption heavy in Asia, leads to the trade in raw cashew nuts. About 3 million tons cross for processing in India and Vietnam every year. In fact, in 2023, Vietnam imported 82% of its in-shell raw material, primarily for processing and re-export. India imported in or around 60% of its RCN for processing, but as you know, the vast bulk of that was for consumption within India. This trade, and it's been growing quickly over recent years, has a huge environmental impact. And this is becoming more and more of concern to consumers. As a result of the imbalance, of course, the trade in kernels goes the other way. Mainly from Vietnam to North America and to Europe. In North America, Vietnam has an incredible 88% market share in 2023. A little bit less in Europe, about 75%, and growing shares in the Middle East and East Asia. In China, of course, Vietnam dominates. So we have a growing consumption. We have highly centralized processing, highly centralized consumption, and highly centralized production. Unfortunately, none of the three are in the same place. And therefore we have this huge trade in raw cashew nuts and this long trade in kernels. And this has big impacts in times of rising costs, in times of concern for the environment, and in times of concern for the carbon footprint of our industry. So let's focus a little bit more on some of the segments of the industry, and we'll start with production. It's difficult to estimate cashew production. The figures are unreliable at the best of times. So we have to put a lot of time and effort in to try and get some real numbers out. You can see production has been rising, and you can see still in 2024, we have quite a wide gap between our low estimate and our high estimate. So the way we do it is we make a high estimate, we make a low estimate, and over the course of the year, we bring the two together to come to the final figure. Still, this gap is quite wide. But if we look at the longer term trend, we can see that over the 10 years up to 2023, production has been growing relatively quickly, just over 6% per year. It has actually accelerated in the last 5 years, and it's hit just under 7% in that period. That's fast growth by any measure. Up to 2020, the main area driving production growth was West Africa. But from 2020 onwards, Cambodia has taken over as the driver of cashew production worldwide. And that's why we see this increase from 6% to 6.8% in annual growth between the 10-year and the 5-year trend. If we look at some of the trends in the origins, we see in West Africa, certainly more trees are being planted, but yields remain low. In Cambodia, in 2024, even in the face of poor weather, poor growing conditions, we saw a much bigger crop because more new plantings came online during the year. If we look overall at area, the area under cashews in Cambodia continues to grow, but growth is slowing. In West Africa, growth is steady. Trees are continuing to be planted, but yields remain very low. In Vietnam, production is slowly falling. And as we've seen in India, production has been growing slowly, but it has been quite volatile in recent years. So what we are seeing overall in production is greater volatility over recent years, and we're seeing more and more the impact of climate change, especially in West Africa. And we're likely to see that increase. If we look at the share of production over the last 15 years or so, we can just see how volatile that has been. West Africa's share of production has risen from 28% of world production to 49% of world production. Meantime, India's share has just about halved, even though the Indian crop has risen in that period. Cambodia is the standout factor. Cambodian production has gone from 3% of world production in 2008 to 18% this year. And Vietnam, well, it too has lost big share from 15 down to 7%. So what we've seen in that period is that processing has concentrated in Vietnam and India, but the share of production in both cases has almost halved. In West Africa, of the late crop, of the export suspension, in Ivory Coast, well, it's essentially the growth in Cambodia has offset the deficit from Cote d'Ivoire. So sharp growth in Cambodia and about a 100,000 ton drop in imports from Vietnam in the same period. You would have thought that supply with such a growth would be adequate, but cashew kernels exports from Vietnam this year are up by a remarkable 36%. That works out at about 1.9 million tons of raw cashew nuts. That gives a calculated inventory, taking into account the carry-in, the crop, the imports and the exports, just under 2 months at the end of July. That's come in from 2.6 months at the end of June. So what we're seeing is this big growth in imports has been offset by big growth in exports, and the numbers are interesting. Exports to the US in 2024 to the end of July are up by 26%. China is up by 56% in the calendar year to the end of July. And the Netherlands, as a representative of the largest importer in Europe, is up by 13%. So very strong export figures from Vietnam offsetting what are remarkably strong import figures. Let's step back and have a look at this raw cashew nut trade over the longer term. So as you can see, Vietnam's imports have skyrocketed. They hit 2.7 million tons last year. The trend, I think, is steadily upwards. There is a question mark over 2021, and that's because the figures from Cambodia were probably distorted. And the reality is probably that this is a much more linear trend. Looking at figures to July, it looks like Vietnam needs about another 1 million tons, and that would bring it right up here to a new record for imports, based on current export trends, of course. Looking at India, and in India, I've made an estimate to the end of June. We have official figures to the end of May. Imports look about online, maybe by the end of June, slightly down on previous years. We've looked at production, we've looked a little bit at the RCN trade. Let's have a look at processing, and let's focus on some of the trends in processing. So what we're seeing globally is larger scale, more mechanization, and that means higher capital investment. It also means, and the session before lunch was very informative on this, it sees smaller workforces, greater demands on managers, and that's a key factor. It is much more difficult to manage a mechanized factory, and reduced flexibility. So if you've got a high level of capital investment, you can't close that factory for 3 months because you're not making money. You need to run that factory and you need to run it efficiently. We're also seeing more processing at origin, which primarily means Africa. So in the first 5 months of this year, African processors' share of the European market was 3 times the share of India in the same market. And if we look at the US, African processors' share of the US market was 8 times greater than India's share. That is a remarkable changing of source, and it becomes, or begins to become, a challenge to the domination of Vietnam in those key markets. The fourth aspect I'd highlight is that the export of secondary processed products is increasing, especially from Vietnam. And you can see on this chart, we'll just highlight a little, you can see on this chart that the total import of roasted or consumer packed kernels into the United States has been moving up quickly, just above 30,000 tons, and it grew last year by 15%, and so far this year it's grown yet again. Leading that is Vietnam, followed by India some way behind, and Thailand. So this is a major trend, and it is a trend that is part of the official policy to develop the Vietnamese cashew industry. And it might be an interesting aspect to discuss in the session later when you talk about the opportunity to increase India's exports of cashew kernels. Looking at processing, I think it's fair to say almost everywhere processors are struggling. They're struggling with a number of factors. Staying competitive based on scale, management, and quality of the finished product, and perhaps quality of the raw material too. Secondly, rising costs, particularly in the last 2 years. Rising costs of wages, rising costs of energy, and rising costs of logistics. That's particularly relevant when you're dependent on a distant supply chain. Would you set up a business today based on a supply chain that was 10,000 miles away? It's a big question, but that is exactly the way our industry works. And that contributes largely to a factor of the mismatch between the prices of raw cashew nuts and the prices of kernels, and adds to the volatility. So processors are coping with two supply chains, one for raw material, one for their production, the cashew kernels, and they're operating based on different parameters, different influences, different stresses. And that gives rise to volatility, which compounds the problem. There's also, particularly for Vietnamese processors, this strain between the need to make forward sales, because that's the way to get market share in this business, particularly if you're selling in North America or in Europe, you need to make forward sales. But it's very difficult to source your raw cashew nuts at the same time. You may be making cashew kernel sales 6 or 8 months forward, but you can only source your raw cashew nuts 3, 4, 5 months later. So it forces Vietnamese processors, for example, to start every season with a short position. And as we've seen this year, when prices rise, well, that creates quite a mess for everyone. Processors are struggling. On the other hand, if we look at the trends in demand and consumption, we see very positive numbers. We see 10-year trends in consumption rising by about 4%. It is a little bit slower than it has been. It's down from about 5.6% in 2021, but nonetheless, it is raising positively. Global demand slowed in 2022 due to inflation, due to costs, due to uncertainty following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That has been followed by fast growth in 2023. Again, the reversal of those factors, low prices for the products, falling inflation, reduced economic uncertainty, lent themselves again to fast growth in 2023. And so far, that's followed in 2024. We have record shipments. We also have higher prices, and now we're seeing defaults and delays on contract since prices have risen and since the raw cashew nut supply was slightly disrupted, much less disrupted when you look at the numbers, but certainly the discussion in the market was about disruption to that supply chain. There is a big question mark over demand in the second half of the year. Now, it was interesting this morning to look at Vietnam's export figures for July. There is no clue to any problem if you look at the export figures from Vietnam during July, particularly to the US market. Over 20,000 tons of kernels shipped, according to Vietnam Customs. That would be one of the best months on record. But let's be cautious, because we've seen it in the past. We saw it in 2022. A good first half is not necessarily followed by a better second half. In 2022, we saw exactly the opposite. So cautious optimism, big question marks over demand, particularly in the US, but also in Europe and China and the Middle East in the second half of the year. And if we look at the share of markets, we can see the relative importance of markets. Of course, India is by far the largest consumer of cashew kernels in the world. About 37% of the world's cashews are consumed in India. China is the fastest growing market, and you can see in this chart, let's blow this chart up a little bit too. So you can see in this chart that China, the dark red bars, has also been growing quickly, especially in recent years. You can see that the European market has been growing quickly over a long period, with a little interruption in 2022, but returned to growth in 2023. This year, we're seeing strong growth in Europe, about 6%. The US market has been growing more slowly, around about 2% per annum. Spiked during COVID, but that's eased away again. There is good growth this year. There is remarkable growth this year, in fact. Whether that's a function of earlier shipments related to lower prices remains to be seen. Positive demand, some question marks over the second half of 2024. But I wanted to look at what are the drivers of cashew kernel consumption. And I wanted to look at some of the price drivers. So I've broken the world up into areas: North America, Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, China, East Asia, Africa, and South America. And we look at particularly the relationship between price and other factors. And I wanted particularly to look at quality. So in North America, what we've seen is that price is highly important, more important than quality, in fact. Forward contracting, food safety are basics, but the price quality balance has very much shifted in favor of lower prices. In Europe, particularly Western Europe, we're seeing a much more balanced situation. We've seen factors like responsibility in the supply chain, sustainability, as well as quality, balance against price and the other factors. The Middle Eastern market, much more about quality. Now, it's not a forward purchasing market, but quality is more important than price. Some people might describe that as a premium market. In China, we see very much a negotiable situation. The product is new. Many of the consumers are new to cashews. And what we see is different segments, different price quality ratios. In East Asia, generally speaking, quality and reliability outweigh considerations of price. Now, the more important price is to the buyer, the more likely there is to be a reaction in the second half of this year to the higher prices. But what we have noticed over the last 15 years or so is that the quality of cashew kernels exported to Western markets, Europe and North America, has fallen. And that's been mainly to reach lower price points, and particularly in North America. And this has got to the point where in October of last year, a group of buyers asked Vietnamese suppliers to do something about the quality of the cashew kernels. What we have seen is we've seen some of the higher quality kernels being sold in the Chinese market, being sold in the Middle Eastern market, and then lower quality material in order to reach price, and often with the buyer's agreement, coming to Europe. Now, I'm not saying that these products are outside specification. What I am saying is that the parameters are much less clear and much less enforced than they would have been perhaps 10 years ago. This is one of the challenges for India. If you're producing a high quality cashew kernel that you want to export, you need to pick markets that appreciate the quality, unless you want to compete and enter into a price competition with Vietnam, which at this point in time wouldn't be an easy task. Price and quality is one side, but the drivers of consumption are not exactly the same. The drivers of consumption in Asian markets, particularly China, is snacking, new product launches, price is a factor, and convenience. If we look in Europe, we see health, consumers' concerns for their health, conscience-driven consumption. So by that I mean concern for the environment, interest in the story behind the product, interest in the impact of the supply chain. Convenience and reduced consumption of meat are also factors. North America looks a little bit similar, but conscience-driven consumption, at least environmentally related conscience-driven consumption, is far less a factor in the cashew sector in North America than it is in Europe. Now, it is interesting to make one note on all of this. Whereas these factors are driving consumption, you would think that they were relatively free from the influence of higher prices. But one of the key factors has been that in Western markets, the impact of higher prices at the wholesale level in 2024 may be less than expected, because the lower prices of 2022, 2023 were often not passed on to consumers. So an increase in price may not mean an increase at the retail level, depending on the cost factors involved. So manufacturers, roasters, distributors tended not to reduce their prices simply because their other costs had gone up. Now their other costs, well, they're still going up, but they're not going up as quickly as they were, and the price of the basic raw material has risen. So this balance needs to be watched closely, but I suspect you may not see as great a reaction to the increase in price in Western Europe and North America as would be expected in earlier times. Big trends in consumption. I just wanted to focus in on these because these are really things that are making an impact, especially in the European market, but also in other markets. Responsible sourcing and the impact of the supply chain. And that goes from environmental, impact on people, impact on society. Much greater concern in those areas, and that means more laws, and that means more questions being asked by consumers. Great focus on maximum residue levels. In other words, a focus on the use of chemicals and pesticides in production and in processing. Buyers are looking for greater supply chain transparency. Now, I just want to bring you back to the chain I described. A global chain, 3 million tons from Africa of raw cashew nuts. And think about just how transparent is that chain? And right now, the only answer is, well, actually, it's not at all transparent. Fourth big factor in demand and in marketing now is storytelling. So storytelling on these products, where they come from, who produces them. Have a look at other products. Have a look at coffee as an example, if you want to see the impact of that. I'll briefly touch on price, and I just want to put this in place. We're looking at high prices now compared to the last 2 years, but if we go back in time, these are not particularly high prices for cashews. In fact, any time before 2020, before COVID, these prices would have been regarded as relatively normal. And we have seen prices moving up, albeit in this roller coaster fashion over many years. So I think that kernel's prices are relatively sustainable at current levels. How we manage that in terms of forward contracts, in terms of dealing with this current stress in the market, delays of shipment, defaults of contract, how we manage that is critical to the future of the industry globally. Final factor in terms of the big picture is I wanted to highlight the impact of government policy and regulation of the sector. This is an area that has increased in the last 10 years with all kinds of activities from government. So this year, in 2024, we have seen Cambodia introduce its cashew policy, with a target to improve quality and to improve value addition in the country, which means processing. You will note it doesn't say to improve quantity. They're not focusing on more, they're focusing on better. In Africa, we are seeing a much more volatile policy environment. In Benin, the ban on raw cashew nut exports has led to huge illegal cross-border trade. In fact, the exports probably haven't diminished a lot, but the product has come out through Togo and Nigeria. In Ghana, we have seen significant regulatory development in the last 2 years. We now have a system that registers stakeholders that limits the access, particularly of traders, to the farm gate. And there is talk in Ghana of the introduction of a purchasing window for processors, more regulation of the sector. I don't think Ghana will become a highly regulated sector, but I think it will increase in its regulation and it will increase in its profile. And I think processing in Ghana will take off in the next 3 to 5 years. Côte d'Ivoire is the most regulated cashew sector in the world. This year, we saw this suspension on the export of raw cashew nuts. Mind you, if you look at the figures, the impact in Vietnam is only about 100,000 tons out of a total of 600,000 tons exported. So it hasn't really impacted in the way that might have been expected. But certainly the ban has undermined confidence in the Ivorian cashew sector and may well cast a long shadow well into the 2025 season. But for now, at least, the ban is lifted and the balance of exports will continue. In Guinea-Bissau, we saw a move toward much more positive style of policy and encouragement of stakeholders to export through the port of Bissau rather than through Senegal and through Dakar, which from a Guinea-Bissau perspective was an illegal trade. Of course, the problem is that the port of Bissau is not well equipped, and now we're getting the delays and the difficulties there. But I think one thing's for certain, we are going to see further interventions by African governments in the cashew sector, and that many of those will be unpredictable in the coming years. So in summary of our quick overview of the cashew world in 2024, we can say that at the moment, production is growing faster than consumption. In a good production year, unfortunately 2024 wasn't a good production year so far, but in a good production year, we would expect a surplus to arise. Processors just about everywhere are under pressure. I know that's the case in India. It's also the case elsewhere. But meantime, as we heard before lunch, processing is modernizing, it is rationalizing, and it is diversifying. So more countries are entering into cashew processing, and there is a certain rationalization going on so that weaker factories are definitely coming under pressure. And I think we will see over the next 5 years a move toward larger mechanized factories, almost exclusively in the cashew sector. And I think that will be global too. Demand is diversifying and it's segmentizing. It's diversifying geographically and it's segmentizing as new and different kinds of uses come in, and the impact of price quality in each of these segments is different. So marketing cashew kernels is now becoming more sophisticated and more demanding than ever. And finally, as I said, the regulation of the sector is increasing, but this is bringing certain unintended consequences and adding to the volatility of the sector. So there's no doubt in 2024, as in the years prior, we have a volatile sector with enormous potential in terms of consumption, but also enormous challenges in terms of the move toward more modern processing and the reorganization and rationalization of the supply chain. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
We have a question for you on Slido, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Hi, Jim. As usual, fantastic presentation, very comprehensive. Even a novice in the cashew business would be able to get a clear overview of what's happened in 2024. A couple of questions. One is, one will require one word answer. Is the import of RCN into Vietnam that you mentioned, does it take into account the RCN equivalent of the kernel imports?
No, I just spoke about RCN today. Kernel imports would add, I think, about 300,000 tons in RCN terms.
Wow.
To that.
Okay.
Good point, Pankaj.
Okay. And the second question, which will be easy for you to answer, but will need all your 40, 50 years of experience to do is that we are talking of a shortage in crop this year of anywhere ranging from 10% to 20% is the estimate. So let us take 15% as the crop shortage, but that is on the back of a higher carryover in 2023. So this small reduction in crop, did it justify the 80% increase in prices of raw cashews and kernels? If it did not, then what was the driver for this price increase?
Well, I tend to agree with you that the general movement and volatility in price in 2024 was not justified by the actual shortage in the crop. I'd be a little bit more conservative than you. I think that the overall shortage is around about 10%. But I do think that, there's an old saying that, small crops tend to get bigger, and it looks like crops in West Africa are actually turning out a little bit larger than expected. That must be tempered by the fact that almost everywhere the quality is lower. Now, prices moved up and they were completely overdone. They've come back a little bit now. I think that the fact that prices were artificially low justifies the current level of pricing, and therefore I think that the current level of pricing is sustainable, or at least sustainable within a relatively narrow range from everyone's point of view. Now, because we're in the second half of the year, obviously there are people holding stocks, and you're getting a story from them naturally enough to keep prices higher. There are also buyers who are in situations where they have no alternative but to go back into the market because of the increase. So was the sharp upward movement justified by the crop? No, probably not. Was it justified by the fact that we had 2 years of, frankly, ridiculously low prices? The fact is the low prices were not sustainable. Take very low prices, add in an open short position, add in a shortage in the crop, and you get the kind of dynamic reaction that we saw this year. We saw it overdone, it's traced back, but I think 320s in the international market, certainly north of $3 is likely to be sustainable. Current prices around 330 in Vietnam, a little bit more than that in Africa. Maybe a little bit overdone, but short term they'll stay. Big question mark will come when the 2025 crop comes on stream, and then we may well see a little bit of a downward reaction. But I think that for now, at least, the low prices of 22 and 23 are history, and so they should be.
One last question. Now, in about 6 to 8 weeks, we will start with people coming in to buy for next year. So what does your crystal ball say about that? I mean, what do you think will happen? If the processors in Vietnam and Africa and India are asked for offers for next year, and they base the prices on current market, what will happen? I mean, what is the scenarios that you can think of?
Well, first of all, I think that people will be reluctant to commit too far forward into next year, given that they've seen a rise in prices, relatively high prices without any huge upside risk. But thirdly, I think, and this is a big factor, I think the fact that the people are trying to manage delays and defaults from suppliers will discourage them from going forward. I think that more than anything else will discourage people from buying forward. So I do think that it will be, the forward buying season for this year will be much more conservative than we've seen in the past. Now, that's not to say buyers will not need to buy. They will need to buy because they need to manage their risk and they need to manage their commitments. I would be, in this market, on the face of it, you would think making a sale at the current prices would be workable. But let's bear in mind, we have seen volatility in production in recent years. So we need to very closely follow what's happening on the crop. Could I predict the weather for next December, January, February? Of course not. So every time you take a forward speculative position in this market, you're taking a big risk. And one of our key issues is that for many people, they need to contract forward in order to raise finance. So the financing is linked to forward contracting, so that mechanism for financing actually contributes to volatility and risk in the market. That may be a little bit different in India. But these are things to be considered for Indian processors if India were to reboot its activity in the export market.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much.
What an amazing comprehensive dive into the entire scenario and the forecasting of the year that's coming up. At this stage, let me once again remind you that this is the reason why you want to be a member of AICA.